Africa was integrated into the global economy as a supplier of resources and raw materials, and not as a supplier of manufactured goods or finished products. Africa has been a primary supplier of resources, both human and natural, for all four industrial revolutions. Historically, under colonial rule, the continent provided slave labor and raw materials for the first two industrial revolutions, and now supplies critical minerals like cobalt and lithium for the digital fourth industrial revolution. But this has caused serious environmental challenges. Despite this, African nations have often missed the economic benefits of these revolutions due to the resource trap, where raw materials are exported with minimal local value addition, only to be re-imported as finished products. Currently, there is a push for local processing, such as battery manufacturing, to ensure Africa benefits from its natural resources. In this special episode of the book series, we continued our discussion of this new book, Reclaiming Economic Sovereignty in Africa, a natural resource-based industrialization perspective. This book was published by Anthem Press, and a copy of it can be accessed on the link that is in the description panel of this video.
And thank you very much for mentioning the integration of politics and the economy, or economics and politics. At the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where I did my PhD, they have an institute of political economy research. We just call it PERI. It's directed by a professor by the name Leonce Ndikumana. He actually taught me in one of my classes that I took for the PhD, and we had a very particular focus on Africa. So I think those institutes and those kind of integrated approaches to learning these two important items are very critical for us at this juncture, because indeed there is much overlap between the two. I had to mention this, that my background, my very own background, is economic history. At the University of Zimbabwe, yes. So I can't avoid the urge to want to engage with economic issues, because that is how I was oriented into the academic discipline, studying about economic thought. When we were talking about courses on regional integration, I could remember there was another course that was taught, I think, by a professor by the name Nathaniel Chimete. He taught a class called Economic Cooperation in Africa. And the focus was studying these regional bodies, the SADCs, the EAC, the Arab Maghreb, the ECOWAS stuff. And, he exposed us to all those important items. And, it made us understand development issues in a quite comprehensive and detailed way. But let's get to talk about this book. Just like I mentioned, that my background is economic history. My understanding, in as much as quote unquote reclaiming Africa's economic sovereignty, I have come to understand that Africa played a very important role in the integration of the global economy, with the history around colonialism. We've learned that Africa, sponsored all the resources that were essentially needed to propel the first, the second, and the third industrial revolution. Africa is still a major supplier of resources that are propelling the fourth industrial revolution. But the paradox of this is Africa hasn't quite enjoyed the benefits of all that export and of all that contribution. And this is why we have you here. We really want to understand. So what would you consider to be the core ideas of your book and its central argument?
So the core argument of the book is that that while Africa got politically independent, most of the countries, of course, in the 60s, some others later, but predominantly in the 60s, that the political machinery of power was handed to Africa, but the continent has little control in terms of its economics. That's where the idea that the economic sovereignty has not been completely achieved, and I'll explain the reason for that. So the book starts from that premise that for Africa to be truly or genuinely independent, it needs both the economic sovereignty, but also the political sovereignty. At the moment, we only have one. And that is a big problem for the continent because, and I do argue in the book that actually the political freedom or political independence is a de jure type of sovereignty. It's a sovereignty that is given to you formally through formal recognition by the international community, by others, and so on. In Africa's case, by the former colonial masters. They said, now you're independent, here is a new flag, here is your new anthem, here is a new constitution. Right. So it's given to you, largely. Of course, with a bit of struggle for several countries, but ultimately the act is given. Now, economic sovereignty, on the other hand, you have to create it and sustain it and push it to a level where you want it to be. And that is where, in my argument, I argue that economic sovereignty is the de facto sovereignty, because without economic sovereignty, your political sovereignty is only a symbolism.
Yes.
And the symbolism that is manifested in a new national anthem, a new parliament, but actually the power, the control lies with those who have the money, who have the control over your resources, the investments, and so on and so forth. So in the book, I make that argument. But I also make the argument that, however, it is possible for the continent to strengthen its economic sovereignty. And by arguing for economic sovereignty, I'm not arguing for an economic autarky of the continent where you become self-reliant, you become cut off from the rest of the world. That's not what economic sovereignty is about. Economic sovereignty in this context means that I have absolute control over what happens to my resources within my jurisdiction, within my territory, at the national level, but also at the continental level. And so the argument then is that, but for the continent to achieve higher levels of sovereignty economically, that this is a project that can only be realized at the continental level. Again, we come to that idea of Africa's integration, or the idea of Africa's unity. And I'll explain why that is central in the project of reclaiming Africa's economic sovereignty. I also argue in the book that natural resources are perhaps the most fundamental aspect of or dimension of this reclaiming process of natural of economic sovereignty on the continent, because natural resources form the foundation on which you build any economic activity. So if you are not in control of that, then economically you'll be weak. And I'll explain a little bit later in why natural resources are very critical to Africa's economic sovereignty. I do argue again in the book that at the moment, we as a continent, we don't have that control much. But the only control we have is to issue a license on mining platinum, mining copper, mining gold, mining diamond, mining bauxite, mining aluminium and other resources, including extraction of water and things. We have no control over what happens to those resources once they are extracted. They are taken elsewhere and processed into finished intermediate products and finished products outside of the continent, and that in itself weakens our sovereignty.
Yes.
Because for several reasons that I'll speak to a little bit later. So in brief, that's where that's the key argument in the book, and I can elaborate a little bit more later on some of the things.